Bender. I typically just go by Bender, and I am honored to be a Tamron Ambassador. I'm also a NAMPA member, PPA member, and a Nature First Ambassador. Currently based out of San Antonio, Texas, but I do move around. Anybody who's been following me more than a few years knows this. So in a couple more years, I'll be based out of somewhere else. But I travel quite a bit, and I am a full-time nature photographer at this point. So you can see my contact information. More of that will pop up at the end of this presentation, but I really want to get into this because I have a lot of information to cover. So hopefully I won't go too fast for you all. And then we will open it up to, we'll have questions. So if any questions come up, please put them in the Q&A so that Ben can help me field those at the end. And worst case scenario, if we do not get to your question, please reach out to me on social media through Instagram, Facebook, through my website, or through email, and I will answer questions that way as well if we don't get to yours at the end of this. So without further ado, we will get right into it. For wildlife photography, I find it's very, very important, kind of beyond, with landscapes and things like that, you can kind of wander around once you're in an area and find things. With wildlife, you get so many better images if you do some basic things before you go in the field. Okay, so we're going to talk about what you do before you go, and then what you do once you're in the field, and a bit about what you do after, when you get back. So with that being said, we're going to get right into it, and we're going to talk about locations, because some of the questions that I seem to always get is, how do you find wildlife? Well, wildlife is really everywhere. It's in your own backyard, and that is an amazing place to start. I know many of us have gotten really used to our backyards here over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, but it really is a great place to find wildlife, because it's a place that you can continuously go, observe particular animals, get to know individuals. You have a familiarity with the area. You're not having to worry about logistics. You're not having to worry about anything else, that you normally have to do when it comes to travel. And so it really gives you a unique perspective and a unique look at the wildlife that you can come to know. So when I was living in California, one of the first things that I noticed as soon as I moved into my house when I was living there was a family of ground squirrels that was directly outside my back, my back fence. And I was able to watch those throughout the seasons, throughout the 18 months I lived there. And so I got to really know them. They got to know me. They weren't scared of me after a little while. So they would just go about their business, allowing me to get very close and intimate pictures of their daily lives. The same goes with the sea otters, which were just 20 minutes up the road from me. So, getting to know your own backyard is the best place to start. Plus, even if you don't have super interesting wildlife, it's a great way to practice, so that when you do get a chance to travel, you're not having to worry about, oh, you don't know your gear, or you haven't been practicing, you're a little rusty. This keeps you going, keeps you with a familiarity for your gear as well. However, when it does come to both your backyard, if you're in a new backyard, or when you travel, the internet is full of resources as to where to find wildlife. Everything from magazines to blogs, Instagram, even following other nature and wildlife photographers. A lot of times we have blogs or articles that we put out. You can see where they're hosting, workshops, that sort of thing. And that gives you an idea for the locations of interesting animals. So when I was doing research, when I was living out of my RV a couple of years ago, I was looking for locations that I could park an RV that would accept dogs, since I was traveling with my 2 dogs. And I happened to come across some reviews for a RV park out kind of in the middle of nowhere in southern Arizona. And it mentioned that it's a great RV park, except that you get woken up at 3 a.m. by braying wild donkeys. And I said, that sounds like a place for me. I don't mind being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning if it means that I have wild burros right outside my door. And sure enough, I went down there and I was able to stay down there for, I ended up being several weeks over the course of a couple months. And I got to know these wild burros and their daily habits, and I was able to capture a bunch of images of them because of that. Again, I was reading through reviews and I happened to pick up on the cues that there was wildlife in the area because somebody was complaining about it. So, you know, you can use different resources on the internet in different ways when making notes of where wildlife is. And in that, if you don't already have a list going, make sure you have a list and you start a list of places that just, you know, catch your eye, that somebody has mentioned there might be wildlife there. That way, if you get some downtime, you can look further into those locations and grow your list of places so that you can automatically say, oh, I'm going to the UAE. I know that there's a rest stop where there's flamingos because that's what the previous image was. You know, but at the same time, guides can be invaluable when going to new locations. And this includes friends who know their backyard. And one of the reasons you should get to know your backyard so that you can trade backyards, basically. But guides and those who are familiar with their backyards or are familiar enough with locations that they go to frequently can be invaluable to knowing the local wildlife, knowing their habitats, knowing their habits, and getting you in position to get the best images. So, you know, do consider hiring people when you're looking for wildlife and you're traveling. In this situation, for this particular image, I ended up being able to spend about 16 hours over 4 days with this family. It was the mother, which is this light cinnamon colored brown bear here in the front, and one of her cubs, one of 3 cubs in the background. We got to spend about 16 hours with her over 4 days because when I went to Alaska, I had a good friend who had a friend up there who knew where the bears were. And we all went together and we were able to watch this family. And I was able to shoot for hours every day while this family fished in this river with only a handful of other people around. Why? Because we knew a local in the area who was willing to show us around. So again, getting to know your backyard and then pushing that out there and, you know, reciprocating with other photographers is a great way to get guides in other areas as you travel. But guides also include those with specialized transportation so that you can get unique viewing situations. Things like whales, even sea otters to an extent, they're really best accessed or only accessed through using things like boats. Well, I don't own a boat, so I have to hire somebody in order to get out on, say, the Monterey Bay where this humpback was doing chin slaps, in order to capture the images. So when you think of guides, think of how, you know, transportation does play into your shooting and what is needed when it comes to the logistics of certain images that you might want to take of certain species. And I want to touch on gear now, because once you have your locations pinned down, you know, whether you're going to be photographing birds in the tropics, whales off of the California coastline, or, you know, bighorn sheep in the desert, you have to have certain gear. And a lot of times when we talk about gear, everybody automatically thinks of their camera setup. Well, to me, I think proper clothing is the most essential gear that you can have. Not only can it put you in a bind when it comes to actual survival if you don't have the correct gear when it comes to clothing, but if you're not comfortable, you're not going to create better images because you're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to want to, be rushing because you want to get back into climate controlled areas. So be very aware of how you dress and how you feel when you are in certain situations. The more comfortable you can be, the better images you'll have because you're going to be willing to take your time. So in cold weather, ensure that you have layers, ensure that you have hat, waterproof boots, gloves. Face coverings have now become kind of, the norm, but make sure it's a warm face covering when working in cold weather. Especially with cold weather, it can be easy to get hyperthermic. It can be easy to, get frostbite on fingers and toes. So be aware of that when you're shooting in those type of climates. But the same goes for hot weather as well. Again, I stress layers because you can always, take them off to an extent, but you need to be able to put on layers if you are cold. And I always carry extra socks, both in warm and cold weather. Take care of your feet so that they can take you further. And then make sure that the clothing that you're taking is clothing that can get dirty, wet, muddy, especially your shoes. So many times I've seen photographers, who are out there and they don't want to bend down or kneel down to get a better, the better angle on their subject because they don't want to get their pants dirty. So, make sure that the clothing you're packing, just because say you're going to Bali, doesn't mean that, you should only carry, tropical, nice clothing. Make sure you're bringing clothing that you can actually photograph and work in. And then carry hand sanitizer. I had this in here way before COVID. It's always something I carry because especially in humid climates or climates where there are insects and you use insect repellent, it can get on your hands and that can actually take some of the writing off of your cameras. I have buttons that no longer have any symbols on them because it's been taken off by the insect repellent. I don't know what that says for what's in it, but it works. But using hand sanitizer will remove those oils and remove that film from your hands so that you can handle your camera equipment without doing damage to it. So if you don't carry hand sanitizer for what's going on anyways, carry it because it will protect your gear. So once we have that, let's talk about camera gear. Lens selection. Ideally for wildlife photography and certainly bird photography, you want to have something that's a minimum of 400 millimeters. You can get away, if you're using a crop sensor body, you can get away with say like a 300 millimeter, but anywhere between 400 and 600 millimeters is typically where I'm shooting my wildlife. Making sure that it has vibration reduction so that you can handhold in situations or that, that you can move quickly with it and the vibration reduction is going to help stabilize those images for you. And then weather resistance and or proofing throughout the lens, and that's not just at the mount but throughout the barrel. You can either do this through stock build like my Tamron 150-600. Don't have to worry about it. It's weather proof through the barrel. It's got that water resistance to it. But you can also add covers if you're worried about your gear. You can add, they sell lens coat and a couple others do actual covers for your lenses to help protect it. Those also come into play even if you're not working in, say, the rain. If you're working around the ocean where there's going to be salt spray in the air, it can be very helpful. If you're working in desert or other dusty situations, it can help keep the dust out of it. So weather resistance and proofing isn't just for rain, and precipitation. It's for all the elements that you encounter out in the air. And then you have your weight considerations as to what you are comfortable carrying for the length and duration of your trips, of your hikes, where you're going to see the wildlife. In my bag, I carry the Tamron 150-600 G2. That is my absolute baby. I have it with me at all times, and it goes pretty much everywhere with me. The other one that I carry is the Tamron 100-400. I use that a lot in situations where I know the wildlife is not going to be too far from me. It's super sharp, lighter weight than the 150-600, and it's a bit smaller. So if I'm in tighter situations, it's very handy that way. And then I have the Tamron 18-400, which I love using as my general travel lens, because that way I can do landscapes, creative, and still get my wildlife in at that 400 level. So those are the three lenses I typically use for wildlife photography. But that's not to say that other lenses won't do. In this particular situation, I used the Tamron 10-24 millimeter at 13 millimeters in order to create this image. Now, since this image was created, this particular area is no longer accessible at this close of range. So, but in different situations, you can get away with wide angle lenses for wildlife too. So I don't want to discourage you from trying wide angle with your wildlife. And then for me, I do most of my shooting, pretty much 98, 99% of my shooting handheld. However, during long waits, when I'm waiting for action to happen, or if I'm shooting from a vehicle, or if I'm shooting, sitting down or prone, I'll use a bean bag for those situations, or tripods if I'm just waiting, and that way I can have my camera right next to me, but I can put it on the tripod, and then when action starts happening, I can just take it right off the tripod and go. So they can be handy, especially if you have issues with weight, then they come in even more handy. But for me, I do so much hand holding. That's what I typically use tripods and bean bags for. When working around water, wrist straps are essential. You don't want to be taking pictures and then suddenly have your camera go over the bow of the boat because of an unseen wave or chop on the water. You want to be able to get your pictures back home. So make sure that you do use something like a wrist strap when working around water or out in moving vehicles. Extra batteries, memory cards, lens wipes. I always carry those on my person. You don't want to have them in a bag where maybe you set the bag down and then end up moving away from to follow the wildlife, and suddenly you're out of battery or you don't have enough memory card remaining in your camera. Make sure you have those on you. All right. So we've done our location studies. We know where the wildlife is going to be. We've realized which gear we need, both in camera and clothing. Let's talk a bit about when we get in the field, behaviors, both yours and the wildlife's. So number one is be prepared at all times. In this situation where this creature, this is a Japanese serow. It is a weird conglomeration of animals, it seems, but it's considered the ghost of the forest a lot of times because you rarely see them. I saw them in only a handful of times in the 2.5 years I lived in Japan, and I was out in the field quite frequently. So but I was actually able to take this. I was scouting a location for landscapes and just walked out on this little, 1.5 lane road in the backwoods of northern Japan. And if I had not had my small point and shoot camera with me, I was using the Nikon AW1 at the time. if I had not had that camera with me, I would not have been able to get this picture. But that was the only camera I had with me. And this is the only image I have of this particular species. So being prepared at all times when in the field is highly important. Another reason I love the Tamron 18-400, because I can just have that on the seat next to me when I'm scouting new locations or driving down the road for you know, a landscape type shoot. In case anything comes up, I have that reach. But also when you're in the field, make sure that you move softly, you talk quietly, if at all, and you try and blend in with the environment. You know, basically what you're trying to be is, I don't like hiding necessarily, because I feel that once the animal does realize you're there, it creates more tension. But I think you should blend and kind of be one with nature as you're going out there. And that includes making sure you turn off your cell phones or silence them. I like turning them off completely in most cases, because it saves the battery, just in case anything came up, you know, emergency wise. I would have a full battery for the most part. But being, you know, not necessarily dressing in camouflage, but dressing in more natural colors, your browns, your blues, your greens, and just kind of not trying to make a statement, not trying to, you know, make sure that the animal knows you're there, but just kind of being, much like you might hike, where you're doing your thing, but you're being aware not to trample or make excessive noise, that sort of thing, when you're out there. That's going to lead to more natural encounters with wildlife, and thus the wildlife is going to be behaving more naturally rather than on edge or alerting, or trying to run away or protect, you know, itself or young. So again, just kind of blend with the environment when you're out there, and things will be a bit more natural. And then obviously respect park rules, regulations, and staff instructions, especially when working in national parks, or state parks. Anybody with something other than a cell phone or a point and shoot camera is often looked at by the general public as a professional, as somebody who knows what they're doing. So be the person that sets, you know, who sets the tone for how we should act out in nature. Be that leader, for the general public. So make sure you understand and follow any rules and regulations for the particular landscape that you're shooting in. And these are just some basic guidelines here in the States, for things like sea otters and sea mammals, as well as the national parks for things like deer and bear. And then guidelines for ethical wildlife photography include, you know, no feeding, especially baiting with live animals. No other creature should have to lose its life for an image. No calling, you know, baiting, scaring, chasing. Basically, don't do anything that changes the natural behavior of your subject. We are there to document and watch how they naturally behave. We should not be trying to influence or change that in any way, because that means then they are having to respond to us, which burns additional calories. They don't have grocery stores. They have to fight for all those calories that they burn. So it's best just to, you know, try and let them live as normal of a life, and we are there to document. And this also includes, you know, the impact that we have on them is not just what we as individuals have in the field, but it's the larger impact we have when we share images, when we share locations. So just be aware of that. And, obviously saying pronghorn are found in Grand Teton, that's well known. But with more sensitive subjects or more sensitive environments, be aware of geotagging and kind of think or pause before maybe giving out direct instructions on how to get to certain places. And if you see somebody in the field, that's not, maybe going off trail or calling animals or feeding them, maybe, stop and try and educate them. Not everybody's up for that, I understand. But most people don't do it to harm the animal. They just don't know better. So that's where education does come in. I'll stop on the topic of ethical wildlife photography, but I think it is very important to know kind of the basics when it comes to our field craft and how we can do it responsibly. But our behavior goes beyond just ethical. To get better images, we also have to be willing to go out and capture images in all weather conditions. So braving, whether it's harsh wind conditions or rain, braving those adverse weather conditions in order to get better images and really tell a full story of the experiences that your subjects have. It brings more emotion to the image. So in these two pictures here, the one that shows a lot of snow, you can tell the winds were gusty. This fox is trying to make it out in this harsh environment. Just a moment later, the winds calmed down and she started walking a little bit more. And so, in this second image here on the right, you don't have all that snow whipping up. If I hadn't been willing to get out of my car when the snow was whipping up, I wouldn't have been able to capture this first image. And yet that's the stronger image. It tells the stronger story. And going back to what I said before about not hiding from your subjects, I think that with rare exception of like things like birds that are hunted and some other select sensitive species, things like fox, they're going to know you're there with their sense of smell, their sense of hearing. They're going to know you're there. So in this situation, I just sat on the side of the road as this fox hunted across this frozen tundra, and he just kept coming closer and closer. And he walked behind me, and then he came down the snow embankment and came out and then walked towards me a little bit and then went off. I did not move from my position, and yet I was able to capture him up close because he allowed me to. And he was comfortable enough with me that he knew I wasn't a threat. And so he just went about his business the way that he was going to go about his business, hunting, trying to look for mice and other rodents under the snow. So yeah, so if you are patient and you see a fox or you see a bird and it's way far out there, give it a moment, just sit there, be patient, and allow them to come to you. And this does start back in, kind of the before you go out in the field, is knowing and studying the behavior of your subjects. So if you do your research before you go out on the particular subject that you are looking to photograph, then once you're in the field and you've found them, you'll understand the behaviors they're showing you, and you'll understand certain things about your subject. So in situations like wild horses, I often look for bachelor bands, which are bands of stallions that have not been able to win their own harem, either due to age, injury, or elderly status. So age on both ends, they're either too young, too old, or they've been injured, or they just aren't quite the strongest one in the area. And they'll band together, and for form these bachelor bands. Why do I take interest in those more than, say, the family bands? Well, it's because the bachelor bands happen to usually have more action to them, because boys will be boys. So in this situation, I had followed this bachelor band, and I saw this one stallion come up to a younger one and kind of start nipping at him because this younger stallion was ignoring him. And so the older stallion actually went over and picked up the younger stallion's tail, and they proceeded to have a tail pull, and just frolic about. And I was able to capture the whole thing. And then we had these other two that decided to, a little while later, these two were mock battling it out. These are the sort of antics that come with just a few hours with a bachelor band, because it's the reason that it's called horseplay. It's understanding that these are going to be much more frequent type of interactions with a bachelor band, a herd of all male horses, than it would with a family unit of mares and foals. There you're going to have a lot more familial interactions, so far as, the foals and the moms nuzzling, maybe some nursing depending on the age of the foals, but it's going to be a lot more tender, not so much action. So again, it depends on what you're looking to photograph, and understanding the differences. And you're not just going to get horses fighting just because you find horses. So again, understanding your subject. Shortly after those two stopped fighting, he had a bit of extra energy and came trotting through the river that I was photographing on the opposite side from. In birds, you get things like with cranes, they do this very prominent pointing when they're about to take off. So if you're looking to capture birds in flight, understanding the behaviors behind that, how they signal before they take off. So in this situation, like I said, with cranes, they point, whereas ducks give you a very brief where they will sit up very tall, bring their breasts up off of the water or off of their nest, and then they launch. It's very quick, whereas cranes, they can be pointing for several minutes before they take off. Ducks, it happens very, very quickly. Or understanding that the behavior of things like moose, and understanding where they are located in their environment. So this bull moose, it was early morning. Moose don't really like to be out in the heat of the day. So your best bet is to find them at the beginning of the day, right at or after sunrise, and then right before sunset. That's when they prefer it, because they're a very dark animal and they overheat easily if the temperatures rise too high. So finding them early morning, and you typically will find them in more like the riverbed areas, riparian areas, rather than, say, necessarily, just in the pine forests, because they like to be around the water where it's cooler and they can get to their aquatic vegetation. So understanding those behavioral traits helps you be able to get better images of moose than if you just were to stumble upon them. In this case, I had camped in this area for about a week and followed this moose for several hours, about an hour and a half before he got into this position where the sunlight was coming up through the trees and backlighting all of these wonderful fall colors. And he was there. It was a cold morning. Obviously, you can see his breath. But because I knew where to look for him and I knew what time of day to look for him, I was able to create this image. With rut, pronghorn antelope, I understand that this is a Fleshman response. which means that he has picked up, either he smelled from a place where a female has urinated, or he's picked up pheromones from the bushes that she may have walked by. But he's basically taking those pheromones and moving them across his palate and into his sensory glands. But many males of many species have this type of response. To me, this meant I needed to watch him more fully, because he was most likely going to try and confront said female if he could find the female whose pheromones were interesting him. And sure enough, he started posturing for this female, and I was able to get an entire series of a North American pronghorn basically getting told off. The female did not take to him, but I got the pictures of his rejection. So, you know, understanding that behavior, and then also understanding how the environments and how changing environments in today's world are influencing the behaviors of wildlife. So I grew up in North Central Florida, and when I was growing up, we didn't have things like snail kites, which is what this particular bird is. But over the last 5 years, they've actually started breeding in my hometown. They were never really seen that far north, you know, even 10 years ago, except for the occasional one here and there. Now we've got a very large population that is starting to breed on the prairies outside the town I grew up. The same with the Limpkins. Again, a neotropical species of bird that is now starting to make their way north in the US from where they used to be in South Florida. They're now getting all the way up and having breeding populations in North Florida, Southern Georgia, Louisiana type areas, because the climates are changing and their prey is being able to move further north because of warming climates and water infiltration. Obviously, with wildlife, much like landscapes, you have seasonal differences. So you're not going to get rutting stags in, say, May. And understanding those seasonal differences. Obviously, spring brings about baby animals. Your birds are starting to migrate north again. Deer start regrowing their antlers. Bears come out of hibernation. Insects and amphibians become more active. All these things are harbingers. I'm sorry, I can't speak today. But spring is coming out when these particular animal events are happening. So if you're wanting to capture newborn babies, you need to be out in spring. You have Rosette Spoonbills. This was taken in South Florida. Spring, a lot of breeding activity goes on. But then you move into summer, and then you get a whole nother set. So instead of the wading birds and shorebirds nesting, in summer you start having seabirds like puffins return to land to breed. The young that were seen and born in spring, they continue to grow. So again, if you know your local wildlife, you can actually be documenting the entire growth of a generation, a family generation of your local wildlife species as they go through the year. Summer is also a time that it becomes a bit trickier for a lot of wildlife photography, because animals become less active during the day with the heat that comes with summer. So they're going to be more likely to be more active at night or at those shoulder hours of the day. And then you have a lot of animals that congregate around water sources. So if you know where the water is, most likely you will have more encounters with wildlife because they're in need of more water during the heat of the summer. In species like elephant seals, summertime is when they actually come out to molt. So these elephant seals come out and they shed their top layer of skin And so they will actually be beached for upwards of a month. And so if you want to photograph elephant seals up close, summertime is ideal to do that because the beaches are still open. During breeding season, when the males get very aggressive, most parks and areas are closed to the public, so you can't necessarily get down on eye level with them very easily. If you go during summer while they're molting, yes, they aren't as aggressive and they don't have pups with them necessarily as the pups have grown, but they are molting and you can still get interactions. And obviously autumn, birds are migrating again. Your rut starts in species of deer, moose, elk, rams. Bears start eating excessively in preparation for hibernation. So this is a great time to, if you know where berry patches are that are frequented by bears, make sure that you are watching those areas carefully. And then smaller animals like your squirrels, they also start ramping up storage for the winter as well. So again, it's all based on the season and what exactly you are looking to photograph. In fall, the whooping cranes, this is the most endangered crane on the planet, and they actually come down from Canada and Nebraska. They come down to the Texas coast in November. We actually just had our first pairs sighted this week down there for this season, but they come down and stay throughout the winter on the South Texas coast. Again, if I did not know that, I would not know where to look for this species in winter without having done my research prior. And now I live 3 hours from where these birds come in, and I absolutely adore going down there in the winter to photograph them. It's a unique and endangered species, and this is the only area that you can see, in Texas that you see the wild whooping cranes at this point. So again, doing your research, understanding the seasons. If I went looking for whooping cranes in the summer, I would never find them in Texas because they just aren't there. With winter, animals are more active, so it can be a very good time to do wildlife photography if you can brave the weather and the elements, but they're more active because they're needing to fulfill more calorie intake to keep warm and survive the harsh winter. It also means that they're much more susceptible to us interfering with them. So be sure that if you are out photographing in winter, you are not impacting them because it literally can impact their survival for the season. They'll be easier to spot due to less vegetation. Same goes for you. So again, make sure that you're not presenting yourself as a threat to them when you're out photographing. Many such as birds will gather in large numbers since they're no longer competing for territories, which can be great if you're looking for a certain species, finding out where they overwinter, because then you'll get many more of them rather than having to kind of hunt and peck for 1 or 2 pairs here or there because they're spread out over territories. Others will use this time for courtship and breeding. So again, knowing your species. In Japan, the famous snow monkeys, they come down out of the mountains that they call home in order to bathe in the geothermic waters of the rivers there, which helps them maintain a warm core, a warm body temperature when we're having very harsh winters in Japan. There's also competition over food. So in this case, the fishermen in northern Japan, they will leave bycatch out when they're ice fishing. If they catch fish that are considered like trash fish, or they gut a fish and they'll leave the pile of guts on the ice. Well, the eagles and the fox often will fight over this particular resource. So understanding that relationship, being able to go out there, see where the ice fishermen are setting up, and then, when they leave, being there to watch as the wildlife comes in to clean up after them. So techniques. So we know the locations, we're dressed appropriately, we are there in the correct season, we understand the species that we are looking to photograph, and we're understanding their behavior so we can put ourselves in the best position to photograph. Well, what should we be doing when we're trying to line up? How do we know that we're in the best spot? And to me, perspective is key. It's for wildlife photography, for me, it is all about the eye contact. Really getting in there. Eyes, you know, they say the eyes are the key to the soul. And I think in capturing images where your viewer can make eye contact with your particular subject just brings the viewer a much more emotional response, a much closer and visceral response to your particular image. You know, and that can mean, you know, laying flat on the ground, camera kind of buried in the grass in order to get eye level with something like a pocket gopher. Or sitting up, you know, I was able to just kind of sit on my heels and photograph this fox in Alaska because the fox's height was right there. You know, with me sitting on the ground, we were, you know, I was not having to bend over too much to get eye level with her. Others like elk, you know, you can be standing up pretty much and you're at their eye level. So again, the perspective, the eye contact is, to me, probably the most important thing you can do with wildlife photography when trying to create an emotional connection between your viewer and your subject. But let's not throw all the rules out of the door yet. You know, the rule of thirds is still a very strong rule, especially with wildlife photography, because this allows your subject to have space to move into. So when you're looking at an image, if the image is filled too much and you're trying to get your viewer to see motion, they have a lot harder time with that, because your subject doesn't have any place to move into. So there's no space in the image for a viewer to picture that, say, fox moving into. And here, you know, this is a good example. We have this bird that was photographed in Hawaii, and this is how I originally took the image. But with just a slight crop, you get a much more impactful image, because this, not only do you get a little bit more detail because the image is zoomed in a bit, it's cropped in a bit, but the bird, now your viewer's not being, you know, torn between left and right. Your viewer knows that the bird is looking to the right and there's space for that bird to move into. So if it, you know, me as a viewer, I can look at this bird and go, oh yeah, he can put his head right down there and pick up more seed. You know, again, that rule of thirds, he's taking up 2/3, but there's still 1/3 of the image for him to move into. Or in this case with this long-billed curlew, you know, again, it's taking up about 2/3 of the image, but we've left this 1/3 in the direction of travel so that we can picture in our mind, we kind of have those next steps already lined up just by looking at this image. Or here with the moose. Now this one's a little bit more tricky because he's at a 45-degree angle. So how do we still kind of give him room to move? Well, it's still that rule of thirds. He's filling up the majority of that 2/3 of the image, but we've left a little bit in the back for him to pick up that back leg, and we're going to give him a little bit here on the right for him to move into. Now this is the full image, and you can see how I cropped it. So you don't have to necessarily, if you have an animal that's on the move, you don't necessarily have to, you know, frame it absolutely correct in field. You know, I typically will frame in field a bit wider than my final image is going to be, simply to allow them to have space to move, and I'm not having to recompose every single step of the animal. So again, here's the final image. Perspective also plays a role in the backgrounds and how they support a subject. So here we can see as I got lower, the horizon line came down to that 1/3 mark and just shows that this bird is dancing on the water. This is an acceptable one, but personally, I don't like when the horizon line runs straight through a subject this way, though you're at eye level here. This is going a step even lower where you're actually below eye level, but it brings that horizon line down and gives that bird space so that you can make that differentiation, and you can really tell he's standing there kind of dancing through this shallow water. And in talking about backgrounds, I typically categorize them as two different ones. You have your minimalist, which is the example here with this hummingbird just against a very, this was in a backyard in Las Vegas. So the background here, the reason it's this warm colors, it's because the house behind my backyard in Vegas was this terracotta color. So it really worked to help offset this green and red hummingbird. The other one is more of an environmental background. And you can see that here with these eagles. It gives you a sense of the environment in which that they are living, that they are flying. Background subjects supporting your main subject is another area and thing to look for. You know, here, yes, okay, here's an eagle, it's sitting on ice. But again, this composition with this supporting figure helps balance that image and helps give depth to the image while still making your subject your subject. It's not taking anything away from your subject, but it's help balancing that particular image out. Or here's another one where, again, having that background, that supporting animal in the background really just adds depth and adds to the story of the image. And if you can find contrast between your subject and the background, it can just help make that subject pop a little bit further and give your image more depth. Again, we as photographers are trying to translate our subject, be it landscape, be it a flower, be it you know, an alligator, to our viewers in a 2D, you know, medium when we are trying to capture 3D and life as we see it with our eyes. So any contrast, any way to build depth in our images can help us tell that story and bring that story to life for our viewers. And again, contrasting colors, a great way to do that. And then making sure to diversify your portfolio when it comes to wildlife photography is really another key element to developing how you tell stories with wildlife, how you develop your photography skills. You know, we oftentimes will start with portraits. These close-ups fill the frame, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can often tell a very intimate story. So instead of seeing, you know, okay, this is obviously a mom and her baby snow monkey, but here's a mom and her baby snow monkey, and this is a much more powerful story than that previous image. This really brings the story home of look about how this mom is protecting this young member of the troop in these cold conditions, because you can see he's still got snow on him. So you don't have to see the snow in the background. You know it's cold because they're fluffy and there's snow falling. And filling the frame can create some very interesting stories as well. You know, you don't typically see sea lions captured from this perspective. So you can fill the frame. Just be aware of it and be aware of how much you do it, and if you take any other types of images. And other types would include things like capturing the behavior of particular animals. Instead of just the headshot, are you capturing the full behavior, the full body language of your subject? You know, in this case, this was a young sea otter getting fed by its mom after the mom had come back up with some food. And behavior doesn't just necessarily mean actions. It can be kind of the anthropomorphizing of emotions on animals' faces, or the way that they're positioning themselves. You know, in this case, I thought that this bear, the way when it came up from underwater, unsuccessful once again, I just thought that this bear he just looked just wiped. He was so unimpressed with the situation. You have it raining, he's without a fish, you've got its sibling in the background who's obviously eating on something. So this bear is just completely unimpressed with his fishing day in this particular moment. And then you can have environmental images where your subjects are relatively small in the entire frame, but what you're doing is you're trying to send the viewer to this location to show them what an animal is going through and how they live their lives. You also have high key, which is more on the fine art. High key and low key, both of these are going to be more artistic versions rather than just pure documentation. And then don't forget about your macro opportunities with wildlife. And wildlife is not just deer and bears and birds, but it can also be your ants, your butterflies, your beetles. And then camera settings. So putting all the pieces together, we did our research, we know where we're going, we know how we're dressing, we know the behavior of our subjects, so we can put ourselves there with them. We understand what's going on when we see what they're doing. We can put ourselves in a position from a perspective point of view to capture it best. But what are the basic settings that we can start with? I prefer a very shallow depth of field, anywhere from f4 max f8. And what this does is it puts the full focus of my viewer, of my frame, on the animal itself, and allows the background and the foreground to be supportive but not distracting. Having a fast shutter speed. Again, we're talking about wildlife. We're talking about creatures that are moving. We aren't dealing with mountains and flowers necessarily. So in this situation, you can see that, you know, 1/2000th of a second was not fast enough. I'm sorry, 1/2500th of a second was not fast enough to actually freeze this hummingbird's wings. You need to be even faster than that if you were going to actually freeze all the action of a hummingbird. So for birds, I'm normally at 1/1000th to 1/4000th of a second, depending on the species. With mammals, I'm anywhere from 1/800th of a second to higher, depending on the action, depending on the animal, is where I start with mammals when it comes to shutter speed. For exposure, expose for your subject. So whether that's the bird, whether in this case it's the sea otter, and the reason I say expose for your subject is because when metering white subjects, you can often get into a situation where the camera is fooled. So you want to make sure to watch your histogram. But if I was to do a matrix metering of this scene, most likely I would blow out those highlights on this white mare. Instead, because I metered for her, I properly exposed for her highlights, and then the rest of the scene was exposed based on that. I was able to recover some of the shadows, so I wasn't too worried about it. Snow, as well as glare, when working in marine environments, can trick the camera into thinking it's brighter. Snow can trick the camera into thinking that it is brighter out than it actually is. So you want to compensate for that. Glare does the opposite. Glaring conditions can often make the camera underestimate the brightness of a scene. So watch your histogram when in very contrasty situations. And then if nothing else is in focus, focus on the eye. Nothing in this image but the rabbit's eye is in focus because of the brush that I was shooting through. But this image works because that eye and the eye contact is sharp. That focus is sharp on the eye. And so the entire image works because we automatically know if we can make eye contact, the rest of it, oh, it's moving. Oh, there's a brush. Our brains kind of fill in the rest of the information. If we can make that eye sharp, we're golden. And when it comes to talking about eyes in wildlife, the best images are when you can get the highlights in the eyes. Why? Because this adds life. It gives that three-dimensional view to the image. A flat eye often looks dead. And that's the last thing we want our subjects to look. So making sure to get that eye shine when it comes to especially birds, watching for their head, watch for that tick when just that glare hits on their eye and capturing the frame at that moment. And oftentimes, especially because wildlife is more active at the shoulders of the day, we often are shooting in low light situations. Don't be afraid to use higher ISOs, especially with the technology out there, both in our cameras and in post-production technology. We can deal with noise. It's better to have a sharp image with noise than a blurry image. You can't fix blur, you can fix noise, okay? So like this image here, this was shot at 5,000 ISO with a Nikon D500. And then there's knowing when to break the rules and get creative. I do a lot, I teach an entire other webinar on creative techniques, but do play with things like slowing your shutter down when it comes to movement. It can create some very interesting images that bring in, the arty side, the creative side. It's not for everyone, but it's something you can definitely play with. And then editing considerations. So hopefully by this time you've kind of understood wildlife photography from pre-planning through the field. So what do you do with your images when you get them back home and on your computer? For me, the strongest tool you can have is the crop tool. So in this situation, this was back with those wild burros in southern Arizona. And this was the image that I took. But out of this one image, I could crop a little bit more, get a little bit more intimate on it. Or I can get really close and really kind of highlight that eye contact with that burro. So if you notice, in this, it's the burro in his environmental setting, but you don't have strong eye contact with this particular one. Here you get a little bit more of the eye contact, but it's still pretty low in the frame. You still have quite a bit of environment going on around him. But in this particular one, you really kind of are able to focus directly on that eye contact. You see his eyes and his ears as they're looking forward, and the viewer is able to connect with this particular crop a lot easier than they would with that first or second crop. And just because you're shooting wildlife doesn't mean that you can't go black and white. Yes, a lot of images are really strong with color, but if you're shooting midday, especially, consider going black and white in your post-processing. Here, I really enjoyed this cluster of wild burros in the desert, but the colors just were so washed out because it was midday. I decided to go ahead and change it to black and white and really bring out those lines and the features, how their eyes are so shaded, and those black tips on their ears. The black and white image really draws out those features, whereas with the washed out color, the eye just kind of doesn't really take in the scene because everything's washed. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. And once again, I do want to say that if we don't get to your question, or if I know I've just thrown a lot of information at you, so if you come up with questions, you know, later today into tomorrow, 2 weeks from now, 2 months from now, you have questions about wildlife photography, please reach out to me. You can reach out to me on social media, on my website, through email. But reach out to me with those questions and I'll get back with you just as soon as you can. But I would like to open it up.
Maybe you should leave this up while we're doing questions. That way people can screenshot it with their phone or they'll have it. If you guys want to get the picture, screenshot with your phone of her info, you can just go ahead and do it now. Sorry, I just busted in there.
Oh, no, by all means.
Go ahead.
Thank
Ben.
you all so very, very much. And thank you to Kenmore and thank you to Tamron for your support and for hosting me today. But yeah, I'd love to get feedback and any questions that we can. So.
Well, you are in luck, Bender, because we have a ton of questions for you and
Perfect.
maybe about 10 minutes in which to ask them. But we had a few of the same questions and a couple I think can be doubled up. So I feel like we can get through this. We could do it.
Okay.
One of the initial questions was regarding your use of crop sensor cameras and if you had a preference for that and why that you have that preference. And then also if you use teleconverters ever.
So I use the Nikon D500, which is a crop sensor. It's the Nikon's top line crop sensor camera, and that's all I use at this point. I like it because it means that I don't have to use teleconverters. I can, you know, with the Tamron 150 to 600, that 600 on my crop sensor, which my crop sensor is a 1.5 crop. So that means my 600 is really a 900 millimeter in camera. So for me, because wildlife is kind of my primary love and joy, I don't have a reason to go full frame. It handles noise better than a lot of full frame cameras because there's less pixels, so there's less noise per pixel. So it gets kind of into some tech information, techie type talk there, but yeah, so I really, really love my crop sensor camera. So
Nice. And
yeah.
And then teleconverters, how often do you ever use those?
I don't even own teleconverters.
Okay, well, there we go. We got that question a few times. Some fans of teleconverters out there, I think, or maybe curious about them. Another couple questions came in asking about your camera settings. If you typically, and if you're aware, if you typically use manual aperture priority, shutter priority, you know, what your kind of go-to settings are for your camera. Does it depend on from shoot to shoot, or do you kind of go in knowing like what you want your settings to be and then adjust as needed?
I shoot all manual, so I don't use any of the priority settings. I'm always on full manual, and the only settings that I use auto on are going to be autofocus for most of my work. And when it comes to macro images, a lot of times I will sometimes go to a manual focus at that point, but otherwise it's full autofocus and auto white balance. but ISO, shutter, and aperture, those are all manual all the time with me.
Okay. What about focus mode? Got a question on
Single
focus.
point focus is what I use. Yeah.
Question on, do you ever use any UV filters, or what types of filters do you use in the field?
I use no filters when it comes to wildlife photography. For other types of photography, I'll use things like circular polarizers or neutral density. But when it comes to wildlife, I want all the light I can get in, and UV filters. I use my lens hoods. I've lost lenses more to breaking in the middles than I have ever. If I'm worried about a twig or something hitting it, that's why I use the lens hoods. So, yeah.
Excellent. Somebody back here toward the beginning was asking what kind of gloves you use in particular. You were talking about clothing being some of the most important tools of the
Yes.
wildlife photography.
Yes.
And what you would recommend for gloves to keep hands warm.
So I actually have a wide variety of them. I make sure that I have kind of, a lot of times they call them glove liners. They're very thin, but if you can get something like Smart Wool or some of the other ones that have glove liners that feel, I think gloves are kind of a very personal one, because we are all dexterous to different levels. So I find I work best in glove liners than full gloves, but I will use, it's a UK brand. Now I can't remember what they're called. Something sealskin, not actual sealskin. That's the brand name, please. It's not actual. It's synthetics, I promise. But those I've found are really well, because they're wind waterproof, and they have magnetic flips. And for my particular hands, they fit the best. I've tried other brands, and either the magnetic flips are too short or too long. So that's just the particular ones. But I think that's a very personal type decision when it comes to clothing. I don't think there's necessarily one size that fits all, or one brand that fits everybody when it comes to gloves. So I would just say make sure you have some that work for you.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And so it looks like in a lot of your work that you shared with us today and experiences, it's sort of a combination of work on assignment and then just work for pleasure, and kind of creating art, which you sell prints and things in that way. But the work on assignment, how do you go about you're getting the assignments? Who do you contact? How do you get started in that direction?
So pretty much I'm freelance. So I'm pretty much putting a lot of my stuff is I make my own assignments, which I love. That gives flexibility. We all want flexibility in our work. So I don't have any particular clients that come to me and say, I need you to shoot puffins in May and June. It's one of those. I work with the Journal of Wildlife Photography, which is a quarterly publication, and through them I do a column on species of special concern, and along with feature articles on other topics. But my main column is that. So what do? I give myself assignments of going out and photographing species of special concern around the US or internationally. And I just make sure I can have a continuous catalog of those particular images coming in. So I'm not, getting called up by the BBC and told to go here and shoot this and here's a paycheck to cover it. Though one day, I hope, if anybody's out there watching, has contacts, let me know. But yeah, so it's not that type of assignment. It's self assignments that I know I can use further down the road.
Got it. Okay. Another good question here. Earlier you're discussing, I thought was a very important piece on the wildlife photography ethics. And this particular person asked if how would you go about approaching someone who is not following ethical behavior, either getting too close or being reckless, or they specifically said letting their dogs off a lead when they shouldn't.
Oh, yes, I know that one very well.
Yeah.
I know
It's
that
like,
one very well because it happens quite frequently in California when I'm photographing the endangered western snowy plover. And I will often I don't hesitate to confront people, and I know that's not everyone, but that is me. And so I will say, is this your dog? It needs to be on leash. There are federally protected birds on this beach at this moment. And it's a mixed bag as to response. Sometimes I do nothing, I have my camera with me. So sometimes the best I can do is take a picture, and oftentimes that will at least get them at that instance to adhere to the rules or leave the area. Other times people are like, oh, I had no idea what do you mean there's an endangered species here? And they want to know more. And so then I'm able to educate, and then that gets passed on, and those are the best encounters, is when you can educate because they're going to talk about it to their friends. And so, but yeah, I mean, to me, I do call people out. Hey, you're not supposed to have your dog here, or hey, you're not supposed to be off trail. And once again, your camera, especially nowadays with social media and everything the way it is, the best thing you can do is, even if they start giving lip back, just take their picture. And you can either turn them in or threaten to turn them in, whether you do or not. I typically follow through with it. But that a lot of times will bring them in. But those who are open to education, educate them, take a minute, talk to them about why it's important, why it's a sensitive environment, why, it's an endangered species, and that just by frightening it off its nest opens it up to losing calories where it won't be able to take care of its babies properly, things like that. And more often than not, people are receptive. But you do get those jerks out there.
of course, yeah, they're always going to be there regardless.
They're in all, yeah, they're everywhere. So
all right, time for just a couple more quick questions. A couple more folks asking about to kind of further explain shoulder time.
So when I say the shoulders of the day, I mean like those couple hours, either like maybe like a half hour before sunrise to a couple hours after sunrise, and then a few hours before sunset to maybe a half hour after sunset. That's what I consider shoulder. It's not always golden hour. So that's why I term it shoulder, the shoulders of the day. We're at both ends of the day where the sun rises and sunsets. So that's where that term comes in.
I think that seems like it's gonna maybe catch and become like a very popular term as coined by Alyce Bender here.
By all means,
first.
please. Yes.
And then let's do two more real quick questions. Yes or no answers if you want. Have you authored any books?
No books yet.
Okay.
In the works.
That would be exciting. And then lastly, a few people wondering if mirrorless is in your future, if you're considering it, or where you stand on that.
I know eventually I'll go to mirrorless. It's going to be a while though. The lenses have to be there, and there just has to be a little bit more pro to it than what I currently have, because what I currently have really works really well for me. So yeah, it's the way everything is moving. So I know eventually I'll be there, but not quite yet.
Excellent. Alrighty, with that, I think we need to call an end to our class here and make way for the next class, which I'm
Yes.
sure will be fine, but it's definitely not going to be as good as ours. And you know, like Bender said, folks, you know, follow her on social media. Check out our website. There's a wealth of great photos, you know, on the social media, obviously, continued wealth of knowledge, just like she presented here today. And Bender, I have to thank you again so much for coming and doing this for us. Always a pleasure. We always can count on a great presentation from you, and then just incredible photography that always makes me ready to run out and sit in snow for hours with a camera and lens.
I'm just going to say, I
Yeah.
spend most of my time laying down on the job, and it's great.
Nice.
So,
Yes,
but thank you all
thank
so
you.
very much. And if anybody
Yeah.
has questions, please reach out to me after the presentation. So thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you, Alyce, so much. And I love the content that you were giving about the being ethical out in the field. It is so important right now with this
Very
influx of tons and tons of people that are out there now.
Very much.
Really, really good. Nature first. Yes.
Yes.
I like that. Yes,
Yes.
yes. So thank you for all of that. That's super awesome. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Ben, for bringing her here, Alyce.
Of course. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And again,
Yes.
folks, please keep Kenmore in mind for your Tamron interests, needs, and or
Yeah.
questions.
Come on
And if you're local,
down.
we'd better see you today or tomorrow.
Come on. Yeah, you better come in this weekend. Yeah.